Hello, Cathy. How are you?
I'm delighted to be having this chat today with the release of your amazing book. So we're just going to drift away on the on the short story and anything else that that flows along. One of the things I was just saying to you there was that when I was rereading your book this weekend, the sense of layers of other literature, I suppose I kind of do think that as well as life, books are made out of books. And I was fascinated to see so many just little resonances of the course that you and I both did back in the day with Greg Baxter in the, anyway, it might have been the Writer Centre, but we certainly did a course on Russian writers and how, yeah, it as you said, it blew it all open for both of us. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember because at that stage, I had done about 3 of those creative writing courses, you know, the 10-week ones up in the Irish Writers Centre. And I remember I was able to write by then I was kind of able to write a passable essay, you know, something that was kind of, that was okay, but I was unable to write a short story. I just couldn't. I couldn't do it, you know. I always felt sort of hamstrung, you know. And looking back on it now, I think more that part of that reason is because in Ireland, the short story is a major art form, you know, and it's got a very, very exalted position in anyone involved in literature, but most people know what a short story is and know what a good one is and all that kind of stuff. So it has a very, very elevated position, like far higher than, you know, things like maybe visual art or, you know, architecture. It's in the public mind. So I think I was quite hamstrung by the idea that I might try to take on or try to write something like an Irish short story, you know. And it was when we started doing these Russian short stories, particularly Daniil Karm's, he was the main one for me that kind of totally broke it open. There's this idea that being completely absurd is not bad literature or silly, you know. Actually, absurdity is really, really serious and really important, apart from being extremely funny. And I remember at the time I had been reading, say, some Raymond Carver. And I remember I was chatting to Greg about it at the time, and he said that Raymond Carver is obviously a master and all that kind of stuff, but there's a sort of, I think Greg thought of this about a lot of American 20th century writing, that there's a sort of a monochromness to the emotional registers in the stories. It was like great love or great sadness or this kind of stuff. And that what Greg admired about the Russians and what I came to admire about it was that this absurdity introduced it made far richer the sadness and far richer the joy and far richer the seriousness, let's say, because you had this kind of other end, this other extreme also in the story. And once I started seeing that, then all of a sudden I was able to write short stories, you know, in inverted commas. And I remember your work back then as well. I'd been reading your writing as well before that, obviously, and I've been hearing you reading up at the Irish Writers Centre at different sort of reading class events and this kind of stuff. And then I remember your stories, and when your book came out last year and I was reading through that book, Modern Times, I was struck very much so. I was brought back to that kind of, the energy of that time of like, yeah, absurdity is entirely okay. So yeah, that was the thing in terms of the short stories, certainly for me. That was the thing that completely broke it open, and then kind of off I went. And at the time as well, you might remember this, Cathy, like I certainly took it very seriously, this idea of not really planning anything that you write, you know, no plot and no charting out where it's going to go and that kind of stuff. And I found that at the start, you know, and I still write like that. I write everything like that. I don't plan a word, not even a sentence, you know. And what it was, I think of it as writing out of the back of your head, and it just splurges out onto the page and it's a mess, you know. So when you couple that with this sort of absurdity that we were encountering in the Russian short story, then what you get is maybe a kind of madness on the page, you know. And then it's very hard, like a lot of the stuff that I would have written at first, it would be very, very hard to turn around and go, oh, that's a complete narrative, you know, because it was just a splat of madness, you know. And then over time, you kind of learn how to work within that realm, and you learn how to bend a narrative into it, or to produce a complete narrative arc. And those are the things that kind of happened. That took a very, very long time as well for me, you know, to do. to actually craft in that world, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's quite fascinating. I suppose we would both start out by certainly acknowledging how incredibly lucky we were to do that course, to have somebody like Greg with his depth of knowledge and vision, and you know, just how formative it was. Yeah, I had pretty much exact kind of same experience of reading stories that I suddenly felt, you know, that thumping in the chest of affinity, of you know, a sense of shared voice, which of course makes no sense, but that's the way it is. And I think as well for me, like some of the stories, I mean, I read them over and over and over and over again, and I think that the characters that were from the margins and from the edges, and the kind of upside downness of the logic, things like Sinbad the Sailor, this old woman who, you know, is so poor and so tragic and so worn down, she collects bottles to get a few pennies, and it's one of the most powerful love stories that she's been writing the same line of pushkin poetry every day for her whole life. I think that just yeah, it was like literally just looking at the world then like from a totally different perspective. And yeah, so it's the same thing. And when I was rereading your absolutely fabulous book, Midfield Dynamo, I was just it was a gift on so many levels, because I was loving it and traveling back in time, and you know, having the resonances of so many other stories coming back to me. And I think that you have a great artistic freedom when you're that ability to remain in the doubt and you know, let the mess out. I think as you get into some away from things, it's a long time now since that course on Russian writers. I'd love to do it again. You can get a little bit, you know, tidier or neater, you know, expectation. And yeah, the fuel of the anarchy of what could be a story. And I remember us even debating in class, you know, is this like paragraph about old women, you know, falling out windows, how can that be a story? And I became obsessed with that idea for a while, until you realize that it is what it is, and we make our own way out of it. Both in your work, I see how you have taken all that influence, but you've made it like exquisitely your own. Exquisitely your own. And it was also fascinating for me to see, like with the sense of poetry and absurdity and illogic, how Irish your stories are as well. And I love that idea that you set them sometimes, you know, in a very particular Irish location. You have Irish dialect, and in the middle of all that, it's an extraordinary mesh. And you still, like a lot of your themes, Adrian, just they're just so they take you into a deep place. The fragility of connectedness, I found that very, very much in them. Always the structure, and then the fragility underneath it of you know, whether it's mother son or brother brother, or you know, two men that are both suffering terrible grief. And yeah, it was fascinating. Sorry, to see that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting what you're saying there, because I remember when I was writing these, I was also studying the bungalow bliss houses for my I was doing a master's in art in the contemporary world, is the name of the master's, up at NCAD. So it was like all this stuff was mixing around, you know, and so I started realizing that, like, you know, if there were a sort of a sub theme to my project, it is to make Soviet the Irish countryside. I mean, that's absolutely no aim at all, but I realize that that's something that's going on. But what I found was that what I found is kind of the sort of the type of modernity, let's say, the building modernity that happened in Ireland. So from the late, once the state, and like say from the early mid 1940s, with the rural electrification scheme and the Bornomona developments, and then subsequently with the Bungalow Bliss and all of these different planning changes. And when you started looking at things like planning information documents and this kind of stuff during my research, I realized that actually the relationship that Irish people have in actuality from the country, with the landscape, the beautiful Irish landscape, is extremely pragmatic and extremely mathematical. And that to me then was really interesting, that, you know, this idea of the Irish landscape being something very beautiful and Irishness being something lyric. I was like, no, it's not like that at all. It's actually, it has nothing to do with what it looks like in literature. It's actually, to me, more like this. So
yeah.
that started becoming, so I just sort of went on that route. I was like, why can't it be like this as well, you know? And so that's why, like, people talk like they, like, say they're from Ballyman, where I'm from, you know? But like, say, so in design number 108, what you have is a very, very Russian style story, let's say.
Yeah.
But it's about a bungalow, and all the dialogue and chatting and the tone of voice is Irish, you know, like it doesn't sound like a Russian person. And I'm not trying to do that. So that would be an example of like where that intermeshing just kind of happened, you know. And it wasn't something, I wasn't planning it. You look back at it and you go, oh, that's what's happening. You're not like, oh, I'm going to do this, you know.
No.
Yeah. And that's the kind of thing I think, and I would say, like, in terms of like your work, I would say as well, from what, like, I read your book last year, actually twice. I thought it was lovely. I thought it was brilliant. And it was like, when I was reading, I was like, there's no one writing like this in Ireland. Like, there's no one who writes like this at all. And I just found that idea that, yes, I recognize some of this Russian patterning and Russian structures and this kind of absurd kind of layering going onto it. But at no moment was I kind of like, did I feel like it was being, was it being over egged? It was just like, what's the texture of the story, as opposed to, or what's the kind of the rhythm of the story, and then what's actually in it, you know, what's it saying, what are the words sounding like, and this kind of stuff. So there's all these kind of levels and registers that I see in your work, and that I would like to think would kind of happen in my work as well. That kind of where there's patterns that are not recognizable, say, or are strange, but then there's lots of things that are very, very kind of let's say recognizable, and, you know, like a bungalow.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. It's like we took the same drug. It had, you know, slightly different effects, but the freedom, I think, is the same. To me, the effect of the Russian short story course and reading Russian writers afterwards, and other stuff as well, was just the ability to, I suppose, get rid of right brain form of expectation of what a short story should be, because you're talking about you know, what we think it is and what it is. And I suppose for me, like, how to talk about relationships, or you know, love, how people are in the world, what we think it is, and what it actually is, and the mythologies in, you know, as maybe more than most. I think that's true now. You know, it's hard to generalize, but, you know, I sometimes think that I was brought up within, like, stories, you know, rather than, and it's like, you know, it can be quite fragile where that connection to reality is. So people are telling you sort of these narrative forms of what life expectation and relationship expectation and so on is, but you're kind of looking with these eyes, and that's not what I'm actually seeing. And that dissonance is quite fascinating. I mean, a lot of Ireland is, you know, Apple service stations and motorways and going to supermarket and going online, and, you know, that's, but if anyone asks us, it's, you know, it's waves beating off the Atlantic coast. And I have, like, my mother's from Kerry, and you know, she spoke Irish, and there was no such thing as, you know, factual telling of anything. So I think that the Russian literature and the kind of illogic, to me, suddenly, like, very logical, and very, and the freedom of it, and I see it I see it all over this work, but also, like, I'm going to just indulge myself a little bit and just, you know, one of the things that you have so much, Adrian, is just this with language. You have it in your novels, and you have it here. There's so many stories, you know, that you can. As another writer, you have your pen out writing your lines into my notebook, you know, because it's just the beauty. Can I read a sentence?
Oh, please. Yeah. I mean,
it's from, I mean, there's so many, but it's from the story Two Silences. And he'd return then to his own bed, where sleep would eventually come to him too, but only in those deep and dark places, plumbed most deeply and darkly in the moments just before he woke again in the morning. I'm like, oh my God. There's, you know, there's an accuracy and a precision that's in all of your work, that engineer side of you. There's nothing, I mean, you really, you don't use any words to decorate your stories. There's no, but I just think that there's that whatever way the Russian hit the Irish, hit the art, hit the engineering, there's just as well as all the thematic stuff and the surreal stuff and etc. There's very, very beautiful just plain writing in it, which actually reminds me it's kind of Chekhov, Flaubert, that very precise.
Yeah, no, it's funny because like when I was writing, when I started doing the creative writing courses, I hadn't written creatively since my Leaving Cert exam in 1995. So like I had left any sort of creative writing or anything like that, and I worked as an engineer. So you're writing formal reports and specifications, and it's passive language, and it's, you know, it's kind of what primary structure language, and it's kind of you know, there's absolutely no decoration. It's completely inappropriate to be writing decoratively in an engineering report. You know, the stunning beams were arched grandly across the side. I was like, what are you talking about? And I think that was definitely something like that would be in me, is that kind of it's now I think of it like when I try to write, when I try to be precise, I try to kind of deaden myself, you know, I try to kind of just fall out of myself while I'm writing, as if I'm kind of like pulling, as if I've removed my heart, you know, and I'm sitting there emptied out somehow. And that's how I kind of, that's how I enjoy when I feel like there's something dropped out of me. That's when I'm writing and I can feel there's a precision coming. And that's the, then by doing that, then ideas start coming as you write. And a lot of the writing is just me thinking, you know, it's not necessarily me trying to produce writing, it's just thinking, you know. Of course there's craft and that kind of stuff, but a lot of the first instances of the writing is just sort of the order of my thoughts, you know, and the form of them, let's say, or the contours of them, or whatever. And that's, I think, where that kind of, so within that situation then, to be reaching for decorative or convincing words in a sort of decorative way, convincing, to me that's the work of an advertiser, you know, or someone working in sales. And this is not my role, you know. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in trying to say what it is that I'm trying to say. And the idea then of the relationship then with entertainment, let's say, or the idea that the reader will enjoy it, is very, very secondary. But then there are, of course, times where you're like, yeah, that would be funny to say, you know, or something like that. Or yeah, let's go drier still because that'd be funny, you know. So that's kind of that's the feeling of when I'm writing, that it's that you're just trying to get to the thing, you know. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it just doesn't, you know. Yeah, and like in Prosanecki, you know, the short story.
Yeah.
When I was writing that, this idea came to my head. I've awful trouble with similes. I would put that into the category of, like, I was thinking about more recently, just to use another analogy, actually to use a simile really, that that I think of similes as being not the business of the writer. And I also think of metaphors as not the business of the writer either. And in relationship to metaphors, I always think that the writer is, what I always think of the writer in that case as being someone who's footing a row of turf, right? And they're working on the row of turf and they're footing this row of turf. And over their back, behind them, there are clouds forming. and they are none of their business. The clouds are for the other people to look at and to put together and to pull together, this kind of stuff. But your work is to produce, is to work with your back to the sky, you know. And that, I think, and then all these other things will happen because writing produces these thoughts in people, and it's happening whether you know it or not when you're writing. So all of these larger metaphoric aspects or whatever, they're gathering like clouds behind you. And then I think in relation to simile, I remember I came out with this in one of the classes, and I think you were in it, but this is an early problem that I had. I was like, that there should be no similes, that they should be banned, or something controversial like that. I said, I think I was just looking for attention. But anyway, but in Prosanecki, there is a description where the footballer hits particular passes that are, they are measured passes, they're appropriate passes for the situation. So Prosanecki, this footballer, looks at the landscape and decides how best to alter it, you know, and what best pass can I hit, and not which one will the crowd enjoy most. And so he would describe a pass that's showy, you know, a crossfield ping that's not necessary, when actually the 5-yard pass that way is far better. That would be a sentence, that would be a simile without a sentence. And that was that analogy that'd be a philosophy that I would kind of actually hold myself towards writing. And that, I think, produces the kind of maybe the drier end of the writing, you know, is this kind of, I don't know if it's not intentionally austere, I don't think it is, but I think that might be to describe it, I don't know. But that's my relationship with those two things, like metaphors and similes. They're not my business, you know.
That's fascinating. It's fascinating. I think that we were very lucky in those days, even though it's not that many years ago, that the amount of freedom of discussion when you're like, there were often debates, and they could get quite, you know, intense, as they should. And I don't think I've ever had a philosophy of writing in that way, but I suppose the only thing I stick to now is a desire to stay uncensored internally. I think because it's very difficult to not allow this kind of seepage of changing world around you to seep in. And I don't really want to put any constraints on anything I write. I don't want to think, ooh, that's a bit because if I start, I'll never write anything. But what I wanted to ask you on that was, did you find with any of these stories that you wrote, oh my God, what is it? Did you ever shock yourself or surprise yourself?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. This is probably the main reason why I write, is because writing is an exploration. Yeah. And so if you don't know where you're going, there's nothing wrong or right. There's just, you know, or bad. And so everything is an exploration, because you're kind of going, oh, I would never have thought of that in that way. So like the things that I've just taught you there about, you know, simile and metaphors and this kind of stuff, these are thoughts that occur to me when I'm writing, you know. But in terms of like pieces of writing that kind of maybe in this story that I was kind of in this book that I was kind of like, oh right, didn't see that coming. Yeah, I mean, I can say that pretty easily. Houses by the Sea. Yeah. That, you might remember a very early version of that story.
I do. Yeah.
With the cow, the suicidal cow, essentially. That sounds like a sort of schlock horror. it's so kind of, it's not schlocky at all. But that story, so you would read, say, it went up to where Leonard wakes Finn on the ground, and then that's where it ended, the story, first of all. And I was always just convinced that it was complete, you know, or that the narrative arc had been completed or had approached completion. So I decided to continue working on it for years. I mean, I only finished that book. I'd say I started that story in 2009, and I finished it in 2020. Like, amazing. I only actually said that's it now. Yeah, there's 2 or 3 of those stories in here like that. But what I was struck by was the finish of that story. I was really troubled by the way in which Finn treats Leonard, how he sees him as an experiment on will,
Yeah.
what does will look like? And I'm going to come back every day and see how my experiment in his will is proceeding. I found that quite chilling. I didn't like that, but I was like, but that is interesting.
Yeah, and it's I actually like it's a great one, and it's one of this. I remember it in its early days because it's kind of an unforgettable story. And again, like I love so much in it. I needed the money is all. That's what I'm talking about. It's Irish,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And then I imagine the sadness. It opens before me like a burren fissure full of wild and rare flowers. You've got I have so many notes on all your stories, but yeah, I think that the purpose is surely in writing, because it's in so little else, to mirror what the vision is of the particular writer, and not to make a PR job out of it, because we're all suffering from I rambling now a bit, but but just been unsure where our PR job of ourselves, of our lives, of everything ends. So it's the world in all its glory. From I think that the writer's job is to take that burden of not shirking when you see something that you would rather not see.
Is there a story of yours or an instance of yours that you can kind of that you could say describe where like you're like, oh right, oh wow, I don't want that.
Yeah, there is.
I didn't want that. Yeah, maybe could you give us an example, because it might be really it would help me to kind of because it's just purely because I'm curious.
Oh yeah, there'd be more than one, Adrian. And in fact, like I think I'm just I tend to write things and then like forget about them. And yeah, I can sometimes be when Declan put the stories in the collection in order and picked, I think I had about 40 and he picked like 20 or so. And when it turned into a book, I got a bit of I was like, well, you're not very nice.
I know.
And yeah, it was a little bit like I found it a little bit strange, the exposure, and I was like glad that I'm practically reclusive. Yeah, the story where the young woman has sex with the student who has special needs. I was like, what the fuck? But the story, I didn't pull it, and I wouldn't. Because that's not my job, and also a kind of blunt, crude summations of stories are not stories. And I do know that I was reading Ted Hughes's translation of Metamorphoses at the time, and oh my god, it's so amazing. And I see that theme coming up in your work, transformation, which is obviously so extraordinary a theme, so freeing, so poetic, so anarchic, so chaotic. And I suppose I've always been fascinated with beauty being in the most extraordinary, unlikely of places. So there was all of that. But yeah, I don't think that it was without difficulties for me on a like personal psychological level. That it was like I was like, all of this is between the cover of book now.
No,
and
I know.
that's the way it is, but you have to get on and get over. But yeah, I think that's the way it is. And I think that in your work I was fascinated also with the amount of different perspectives that you're willing to take on something. I thought that was quite beautiful, that you're willing to go like a 360 around in Midfield Dynamo. Just that sense. It reminds me a bit of Janet Malcolm and 41 False Starts, like that you have that negative capability, that there's no didacticism. There's so when you talk about your process of sort of letting it come out as it does, I think that's very obvious when you read it, that there's no polemic here.
Yeah. Like, I think with say Midfield Dynamo, and I'm just going to boast here, but I think that's the best thing I'll ever write. Like, I don't think I'll ever write anything. I'm very, very proud of that work. I think that's a very, very good short story by my metric. But anyway, I wrote it very, very quickly. I remember it was just before I left Ireland, and I walked around Dublin City with my notebook, and I just wrote it in an afternoon. And then I sent it to Brendan pretty much straight afterwards, Brendan Barrington. He really liked it. He didn't do any kind of editing to it at all, really. So that's how that came about. But that's one thing that I kind of realized when I was writing it, is that for someone to change their mind, or for someone to realize something, or for some philosophical change to happen to someone, that to me is sufficient for a narrative to be complete. Like, I feel that there has to be a certain amount of people who've got different registers to this thing of a complete narrative arc. Some people like to tidy it off and make it complete, and that's fine. It's not my aesthetic. I don't particularly like it, but that's fine. And some people like to leave it utterly loose. And I don't quite understand my relationship with it, but I do know that I would feel that for me to call it a story, there has to be a sort of a bend. You know, there has to be something that takes you away. You know, and I realized when I was working on this book, particularly, that actually someone realizing something that, oh, I never thought of that before, or I never thought of it like that before. That to me is sufficient for a narrative arc to be complete. What was it that brought you there? And in Midfield Dynamo, that happens in a very strange way. And I can't really explain it, to be perfectly honest. I think you just have to kind of read that story, you know, to kind of get the sense. And I'm sure different people will get different senses of what the narrative arc is in it. But I can't really explain that story because it just came out of nowhere. I didn't plan a word of it, you know. I just set off with an urge one afternoon into the city and stopped at different cafes and wrote these 10 pieces out in different lengths. And they're just kind of, they do center on a father figure for sure.
Yeah.
But then they go into the grandfather figure and jump, and who is the person that's seeing this, and how can he see it? You know, it doesn't make any sense, but it's it kind of, I feel it works. I mean, I do anyway. I'm sure people have different opinions.
And I do very, very much. And I love that. I suppose in some ways, like, you're writing to escape what you think, and what you find yourself somewhere else. And I love that story, and it's something I kind of cherish.
I'm glad you liked it. Yeah,
certainty,
yeah,
doubt, you know, and the ability to just stay there. But Adrian, can I read one more? Can I read a sentence from it?
Batter away there.
Oh my God, this one. As we drove closer to town, the arrow slowly dissolved around us until we became part of its electric umber, sitting outside the chip shop in the back of his car, waiting for our warm packets of vinegar sodden chips. It's just so good. It's just so good. You'd never lose affect, you know, in the ideas. There's, you know, you never lose that. But
just kind of,
there's a lot of father figures, by the way.
Yeah, no, I know. And it's a funny thing is, like, and like the mother figures in it are like total drunks and kind of you know, not really that responsible, and like nothing could be further from the truth. My mother is the most responsible and upstanding person you could imagine. I'd say if she's reading the book, she would just find this unbelievable, the idea of a mother figure being, you know, particularly in design number 108, just out drinking all over the place. Like, it's not. But anyway, yeah, I know. I mean, I suppose that idea of like seniority and that relationship with older people is something that goes through the book for sure. I mean, I was just going to ask you, like, because I was talking, like, I know, like, say when I start to write a story, it comes from an urge. It's just like, I wake up or whatever like that, or something happens and I just go start. What is it that's when you go, now I'm going to sit down and start a story? Like, is there just like, is it a line or a color, or like, what is it?
And it's a little bit like what you said. There's kind of no rhyme, no reason to it. But I haven't written a short story in well over a year. I think it'd be a long time. I did write short stories. When you say continuously, it means that the pen was always in my hand, even if it was doing nothing, like for 10 years. But I don't have it at the moment. But it's exactly as you say it with that story where you talk about the cafes. Now I don't want to move it all into this, but I am really missing, and it's trivial, we'll take that anything is trivial, but I'm missing sitting in like Costa, you know, most anonymous, awful one with like bad coffee. They're my favorite to write in, because I that's what I like, that's what I do. Like I like in between spaces. I always did as a child. You know, I had a very efficient mother, you know, who would be like, if you weren't doing something, you know, you'd better get up and, you know, be doing it. Fair enough. The good old fashioned parenting. So my favorite thing was to slip away, you know, to like slip, like if there were guests in the house, or, you know, and to read, or to just, you know, be doing nothing. But I find that like if I stay in where I live, like I might think I should put on the washing machine, or so I like in between places, and I am often inspired by just a line, or the color of someone's cardigan, or I mean, I'm very, very curious about people without wanting to like get to know them. I'm just curious to, like, I love people. Yes. I was like, for the first time in my life, I was like, I would love to go to a Patrick's Day parade. I would love to stand in the wet cold and watch the majorettes and the marching band. I'm missing just like watching.
I know. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, that's interesting, because I remember like when we were doing the courses, you used to do an awful lot of writing. Did you do a lot of writing when you were on the bus as well?
Yeah, always. Yeah.
Okay, I'm remembering the right person.
Yeah, the dart, and like I wrote, there's a story in my collection called The Chair, and I did write it like I don't think I had to touch it up all that much. I wrote it on the dart one morning going to work. Must have been in a bit of a funk about something, but and I don't even think I had a seat. So I was like, leaning into somebody. But it doesn't happen to, like, I think like in between stories, I might like read I have to read a bucket load to get one drop.
I know what you mean. Yeah. I find myself actually I've been reading an awful lot of, like, say, like books about engineering and books about building and that kind of stuff. And I love when you come across like crevices in the story, like the small crevices, and like, let's say for instance, getting the electrification poles into Ireland, and the crevice in their story is who went and looked at the poles in Finland. And then all of a sudden, it's when you go into those crevices of the grand narrative, you know, there's always people, and there's things that they do, and they've got relationships. And I find those aspects of, say, national history or whatever deeply interesting. Like the official narrative obviously is very important and very interesting as well, but it's the crevices that I just find they open out into other worlds completely, you know. So that kind of, it's funny because I don't read that much contemporary fiction. Last year I read your book, I read Alice Lyons's book, and maybe one more, maybe Neve Campbell's. And then the rest of the year I spent reading Marguerite Yourcenar and technical books and books on philosophy. And I read very, very little contemporary fiction. And I had thoughts on this, and this isn't going to sound very fair or very nice, but I think if you read too much contemporary work, and I believe in this in terms of contemporary art as well, if you look too much of it, it's a bit like poison, because you can become, because what's valuable now, what's fashionable now, can start kind of leaking into your decisions, your aesthetic decisions. And I think you have to be a little bit blind, or you have to be looking elsewhere, I think. And I believe that's, I mean, I think that's the case certainly with contemporary art, and that's what I try to do. I try not to look at like, I go to museums and I look at old art all the time. I'm fascinated by it. But I don't go into contemporary museums or contemporary art galleries that often, because it's very fashion driven. And the same, I'm starting to think of literature, that there are certain fashions and tropes, and I think when you get older, you just know yourself a bit better as well, and you're less kind of like, oh, that's a cool thing, I'll try and do something like that. So that's kind of the reading habits. I think it's like a diet, you know. It's like I think it's like, you know, say if you're training to be a swimmer or something, you know, you eat particular foods and you train sometimes. I think if you're a writer, there's a diet as well. Like you have to kind of, what are you reading, you know? And I'm really careful about it now. I hope adventurous and not conservative. but I am careful about it. Are you careful about how you read? Or are you like, oh, whatever?
Adrian, I'm just fascinated listening to you. I'm just enjoying it so much. But you know, I've said it to you before, and it's just one of those things that maybe has like way more meaning for me than it would for anyone else. But I've said it to you before that my father's a civil engineer, and that I grew up because my parents married when they were like 21 and they had me when they were 22. So he was getting his qualifications or whatever. So we grew up, there was always has to be like one corner in a house. We had lots of different houses and moved around, a spare room or just the corner of the sitting room where his drawing board would be set up. And it would be like, there was no IKEA. So it'd be like bricks, you know, and then a board. And then the rotring pens and the funny rubbers and the big ruler, and so I suppose it was always a fascination. And my father is a maths guy, you know, very literal, you know, and I find that it was a part of my childhood, because then it's all computers, like it's gone. It was a part of my childhood that was so vivid, and I wanted to be an engineer until I was like, you know, realized I couldn't really do maths. So I'm always fascinated with the way you have taken a world that to me had, even as a child, I found it a slightly mythical, you know, like my father was smoked the Carol cigarettes and, you know, the ashtray and the coffee and the drawing board. And I always kind of wanted to be, no, I couldn't do, you know, I couldn't do it. And I find the way you have taken some myth that I have, and that many people have, I'm sure, and that thing you're talking about, looking for the like spaces in things that we, you know, like buildings and drawings and who makes things, and I find it a fascinating aspect of your art, you know. And I do think, like, where are the pipes, and you know, what's under our feet, and all of that stuff, and what are the stories. And I think that's a wonderful way of going at the world. That, you know, this, and I love that, and I always feel that it just, I have that, especially with Sabbatical in Leipzig. I just felt a very powerful connectedness to the narrator. But in terms of the reading thing, yes, I totally agree. I feel that I'm like way more porous than I would like to be, and way more like, you know, a bit like spongy. So I think that it's very easy to have your language infected by like the language of the moment. And if there's anything that I wish I could unlearn a lot of the ways of speaking now, because I find myself saying like cliches and catchphrases and slogans and words, and I'm like, go away. But they stick right inside me. I'm extremely porous. But I do protect my reading space, you know. And I'm a bit nosy though, so I like to like poke my nose into everything, you know, that's going on, and read the reviews, and you know, and stay interested. I mean, I have 3 adult children who are all readers, so I'm never going to be, and they all read in very different tastes, you know. So with my son, it's going to be like a lot of politics. Younger daughter is going to be, you know, very much into contemporary fiction, and Lucy's going to be, you know, throwing other stuff at me, and she's wonderful that way. So I'm kind of kept on my toes with it. But I agree with you that it's you know, it is a diet. But having said that, I am guilty of like low to high. I can go from watching like an episode on Netflix to, you know, to reading, you know, a bit of philosophy later in the evening. I'm not always good. I can be a bit mushy. Yeah.
No, I think it's important to kind of like, and this is the thing that like part of the diet I would put with this would be like, what I listen to are lots of podcasts with footballers, ex-footballers, and I find the stories of footballers fascinating, the way they tell them and what happened, and and so I've become very, very addicted to I'm very, very interested into the narratives of sporting lives. Like last year I read Andy Lee's The Boxer's autobiography, and I'm utterly fascinated by this world champion. He became middleweight world champion. I just found the whole thing completely fascinating. You know, this idea, the way he talked about brutality, the way he talked about compassion, the way he talked about darkness and these kinds of things was just utterly fascinating. You know, the literary sphere doesn't talk about it in that way because he actually lived it. He actually was a boxer. So I love reading kind of first-hand accounts of these worlds, you know, as well. So those things I find very, very, very interesting. And then, like, when I was working on this, I did, myself and Fergal Ward, we made a film about Peter Rice, the Irish engineer, and that's a really interesting thing as well. Developing narrative visually, like for a film. So Fergal has very, very different ideas and brilliant ideas for storytelling in film, and I often send him a story or a novel or anything at all, because I know what he's going to come back to me isn't literary criticism. He's going to have different types of criticism or different things that are working, because he's thinking about narrative in a different way. And I find that really, really, really helpful, his input into these. If you look at these books, he's always the first or second person thanked, because he's kind of looked at pretty much everything that I've written. But he doesn't himself write in a literary scene, but he tells stories in film. So working with him in film has been really, really, really interesting, and I think has had a huge effect on how I've done the novels and that kind of stuff. I suppose, how would it not, because it's storytelling and it's in just a slightly different way, you know.
I think that's really interesting, because I'm a little bit cut off even more, at the moment, obviously, and you'd be afraid of, I think, different perspectives are so fascinating, different views, if it's because you can get too much of literary talk, and a belief that it's real. So I think you definitely want to throw in odds and ends of everything else into it. And I think that's part of, again, just I was fascinated with the football stories in this. I started watching football a couple of years ago, and I've a slightly addictive personality, so just for a while and Champions League tonight kind of stuff, and not in any real way, but the last World Cup, I had a chart on my door and I was ticking off the matches, and you just get a bit fascinated by the different styles and so on. So I think it's I don't know, but I do find it amazingly restful to watch it. Because especially if you're writing, because you don't want to watch, like a film, another narrative that's going to interfere with where your head is. So it's like being able to rest, but in a very animated way. So it's been definitely a new addition and unexpected to my existence. So I got a lot out of that.
I think football is fascinating because it is a narrative, like who wins this match, and it's a question constantly being asked throughout the thing, and there's structure and then there's patterns collapsing into it all the time, and it's just looking at it with no one talking is utterly fascinating. And that's why I was kind of for the structure of this book, when I was sort of I said I was, we were talking, you have this thing when you're when you list your stories in a row, you're like, well, what one comes after the next? I mean, how do you decide on that? That's such a difficult, and there's so many ways of ordering. It's like it's like if there's 12 stories, there's how many different ways to order these 12 stories, And I just thought, then one night it hit me, and I was like, this is how I'll do it. I'll do it as a football team. And then I was able to think about the relationship between the stories in a much different way. And all this idea of one following another started becoming less important, or I stopped thinking about it in that way. And then I was thinking that actually this formation of 4-4-2, I was like, I know this is sort of niche and it's a football thing, but anyone, if you walk, when the streets were open, if you walk down the street on a Saturday and you stop at a pub and you look in the window, they would have the team sheets up on the thing. So everyone sees these structures all the time. They just might not engage with them as football fans, but they see them. And I was like, well, that's as much an everyday structure as a piece of scaffolding out on the street. Why shouldn't I use that as the structure for the book? And then I started thinking about the stories as having personalities. And because I played a good bit of football when I was younger, I was like, yeah, he would, House by the Sea wouldn't be a centre half. You put him in right back. And then you're like, half bird, half bear, definitely not a midfielder, that's a winger, you know. And it just started becoming really clear. I was like, yeah, that's he or she. I don't know exactly what the gender of them are, but yeah.
It is quite amazing. I think it's, you know what I think is wonderful, Adrian, that you for it, that you just, you know, that I think it seems to me to be a great strength of yours, that if you go with how you see it, you know, you go with how you see it, so you get that it seems to be now intrinsic to this book, this selection, and this form, but it's very outside of, you know, I think that ability you have to see the lines of how we live, our grooves of existence in different ways is fascinating. But tell me about this.
So I did a few drawings. So the idea was that when you go into a football, I say halftime or before a game, so you go in, you might have a tactics board up on the wall, and there'd be, you know, drawings of that kind. You know, I want you running right, you know, that kind of stuff. So I just said, right, okay, I'll do a few of those. So I just did 3 or 4 of them, 5 or 6 of them, and then I put them down. And then I did another one, and then I tried another one. And then I was just like, I liked the way it was legible through the sort of the thing.
Yes.
And then it went from a meaningful structure and it collapsed into just meaningless lines, you know, as you turn the page. So you go to meaningless lines and something that potentially has meaning, you know. And then I realized then that when I finished it and I kind of looked at it from a distance, I was like, it kind of looks like a face. So I took a photograph of myself with it up in front of my face, and I thought that's entirely appropriate that this thing is a mask, you know. This book is kind of a mask for me. Because I think there is a certain, and you know, I think by reading your book, I was like, we're like, our books are like, certainly in relation to the work that we've done, there's a kind of a mask effect to the book. It's like, it's me, but it's, you know, it's not me, you know, it's a different version of me, that's in this, you know, and it's the how'd you say, the fictional me or whatever. And I was interested that because all the stories are more or less written in the first person, that this was like 11 psyches, you know, around a pitch, and that the only one written in the third person is the coach, and he's or she is to one side looking on at this kind of, you know, these atoms running around on a pitch. And that's how I sort of understood it then, the form of the book itself, of the whole thing. And
it has a lovely coherence to it. You know, there is which is it has that very strong sense of coherence. And I think in some ways the fact that at times you know, there's a sensation sometimes of, I don't know how you put it earlier, but it's kind of that tamping down a little on epiphany or description or emotion actually gives more intensity, you know. The containment of structure, of form, just actually there's more. And I suppose everyone has their own way of judging it, and to me it's always, I can really love something, but would I voluntarily read it again? Because I'm a huge rereader.
Same here.
And I can really enjoy something, but there are a lot of things that I just know I'm really enjoying this, but I'm never going to read it again. But your book is a book that will go on the shelf of, I will be taking that down, you know, and that's what I'm doing. And also, because there's great pleasure in that for me, that it's like I really, if there's a film I like it much better the second time, because when you've taken away like plot, then I can really, you know, get in the big bath and, you know, just feel every bit of it. And I like, with short story collections, I like to take it down and just kind of cup of tea and one, you know, and I like to do it over and over and over again. And that's what you've written here for me, Adrian, a book that I will be on the shelf with the, you know, a friend for life.
That's the highest compliment that you can give me, to be honest, because that's always the hope. I think that certainly would be the hope for me, and I'm that you're writing for someone who would want to read it twice, you know. And in a world like today, the idea of revisiting, you know, something that hasn't been turned into like Fast and Furious 8, you know, but actually revisiting something is, I mean, it's very, very important. And I think rereading, like, for instance, your book, The Modern Times, apart from the fact that it's the design, the Sting and Fly one is so handsome and kind of strange as well. Was it Catherine Gaffney designed that, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's really, really lovely, isn't it?
Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah.
But apart from the fact that I just liked it sitting there on this table, I every now and then, like you, sit down and reread something and just kind of go through it again. And it's like something. It's like looking through when you reread. It's like you're looking through a sort of prism, but the light's a little bit different this time, or you're looking through a slightly different facet of it. It's still the same thing, you know, in that the words haven't changed, but it's different, you know. And I think with yours, because of the length of the stories, a lot of the stories, it allows for that kind of relooking, and it's not difficult. It's easy, you know. It's like, I want to look at it again, and I think that to me is like that's a really magical aspect of literature, you know. That there is writing where one of its major pleasures is actually just going back to it again and kind of reading it again. And I remember, like, this happened to me when I was reading. It was The Lady and the Little Dog, with Chekhov's short story. And I read that, I don't know how many times I read that. But I made a realization about the relationship between the dew on the grass and the size of the space around and their conversation at that time. And that appeared then in Love Notes as a kind of observation by Joachim, the fellow who decided never to write again, because he was like, I read that and I was like, I'm never going to write again because I'm so happy that that's in the world and that's enough, kind of thing. So I think, like, rereading, you can just, it's edifying in a completely different way to just reading loads of new books, you know, I think.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I suppose that's what the short story, that's what, like, that's probably one of the reasons that you and I would love it so much, because its form lends itself to that. Like, it's you do it, and I do it, and I'm sure you do it, but you'd have to really love a novel to keep rereading it, because you know, it's quite the commitment. But that's what, you know, like, I have my short story shelf, and like, they're my friends. You know? And if I need a certain, you know, it's like if I need a certain something, I know where to go for it, you know. And I
think that's really interesting, what you're saying there, because, like, I often think of that the novel is writing but with a machine in it, you know, and it's outside of this human scale. It's like it's too big. Whereas a short story is kind of pastoral nearly. It's like it's within scale, you know. It's like, yes, I can sit down and read this, or even write one. When you're writing one, it's within human scale. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think it's like storytelling with no machine, or with no horsepower. You know, even though they can be extremely powerful. I'm not saying they're not powerful, but their scale is different. You know, and I think there's something very, very. It's like, because that's an actuality of the form, like, that it's short, you know, and that it's you know, whatever number of words. And how can you approach that aspect of it? I mean, I think that itself has got huge potential, and that's why I was so happy to see your book out last year, because I was like, this is a collection that approaches this form and that allows you to kind of go, it also can be this, say, short, I can also be this long, or it can also be this intense. And that the scale, because your stories were quite short, say, relative, like having so many that are that short, remarkably short, but they still went places, and they still succeeded, you know, in all these kind of really interesting ways. And that to me is like, it just shone a light on that aspect of the scale, you know, of a story. And I found that really, really valuable, actually, just as a kind of a cultural thing, and for that to be introduced into the Irish and the UK market. And I love the cover for the UK book as well, by the way. I got a good chuckle out of that one. But I think that's really important. And I have that in my head sometimes when I'm writing. I'm like, there's actually, this is a scale thing as well, you know.
Yeah, that's it's a great way to think about it. But like, you're in I'm in a club of what must be very few people, Adrian, that you've had a book out in 2019, 2020, and 2021. It's extraordinary. And I don't think you had, like, your Love Notes came out, and then we met luckily at that Bray festival, and you said that you'd pretty much gotten like a sabbatical in Leipzig, but you didn't see it coming. And at that time, did you know that you were going to publish Midfield? It's an extraordinary thing, 3 books in 3 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Love Notes one took about 5 years to write. The sabbatical in Leipzig came out of nowhere, you know, month. And this was 12 years, and it just happened to come together. So it seems to be, you know, really highly productive, but it's not really. It's 3 books in 12 years, you know, and that's not crazy stuff, you know. It's just come at the time. And Anthony Farrell and Sean, who I work with, and Ruth, they're like, if the book wasn't good enough, they wouldn't take it. It's simple as that. It's just the books have been good enough from their point of view. And they're like, well, so why would we not, you know? And so that's been, and it's been wonderful working with Lilliput, I have to say. I mean, and I've learned actually a vast amount about just writing from working with Sean and talking with Anthony and working with Ruth. I've learned a huge amount, probably like in terms of, you know, the rate of learning. When I did those courses with you under Greg Baxter, the rate of learning was ginormous. My head was broken open. I'd say I'm back now. So then I was just figuring it out myself for 6 or 7 years, writing, submitting, like anyone else. And then the last 3 years at Lilliput, my rate of learning again has picked up into that kind of first era when I was like, when I was learning a lot. So when I'm working with Sean Farrell, he's a very, very talented writer and a brilliant editor. And I've learned a huge amount about writing a novel. And also working on these short stories. He doesn't like short stories. He doesn't like them. And he didn't like this book either. But yet we worked on it, and I think he likes the book now. But when you're editing with someone who's got who is somewhat hostile even to the book, it's really useful and it's really interesting. And he's got such a good aesthetic, and he's got such a strong ideas. Like, I'm going to say strong, I mean good. I don't mean that he's imposing them. It's a relationship that I really, really value, and we get on very well personally as well. We meet up every now and then, but I didn't know him before I started editing, like working on these books with him. But I've learned a ginormous amount from him as well. And then with Anthony, it's different because I'm not working with Anthony directly on the books, but I meet Anthony whenever I go home for a few jars down in Walshers or whatever, and just out of that conversation, it's a gentler thing. He'd have you looking in different directions, and these books are Lilliput books because they're coming out of, apart from the fact that they're published, but they're coming out of me interacting with the people who work at Lilliput and have made Lilliput, and that their thoughts and ideas are finding themselves into the book in a gentle way. It's not like, oh yeah, there's a reference, I'll just bring it in. It's through chat and work, and that to me is really, I value that greatly, you know, as well. Apart from the fact that
that's fantastic.
Nice,
yeah, it's fantastic, Adrian. I do think like there's something about, you know, kind of just the energy that, you know, you get from working, and I love what you're saying there. I just think I kind of cherish it that it's not always about, you know, agreeing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not. I don't think that's where the best energy comes from. And it's just about like being happy to be in the same place.
Yeah,